Hi everyone, my name is Ryan P. Johnson. Welcome to Western Civ 2. In today's lesson, we'll be exploring the Cold War. If you are a current student in my class, as always, there's a quiz that accompanies this presentation located in the Cold War module in our course LMS. If you haven't already accessed the quiz, please do so now. For anyone tuning in that is not a part of my class, welcome. It's good to have you on board. My students have likely had enough time to get the quiz up, so let's get to it. In this presentation, we'll examine how Europe was divided at the end of the Second World War, the economic recovery of both Western and Eastern Europe in the immediate post-war years, the process of decolonization throughout the world, and finally, we'll briefly examine some cultural developments in the post-World War II era before finishing off this lesson with the Cuban Missile Crisis. As the Second World War ended, tensions began increasing between the two remaining, quote, superpowers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. This tension effectively split Europe in two. The Western zone, which was capitalist, democratic, and aligned with the US, and the Eastern zone, which was communist, took its marching orders from Stalin in the Soviet Union, and was aligned with the USSR. During the war, millions of people became displaced, either forcibly moved from one region to another, or moving to get away from the ever-changing battlefronts. This process of migration continued after the war ended, as some tried to make it back home, and others were forced out of wherever they happened to be. Roughly 3 million people began moving west, trying to get out of the Soviet Union. 1.3 million people moved between Poland and Russia, while around 2 million people moved between Germany and the USSR. There were also many folks pushed out. For example, a total of 7 million Germans that had relocated to places in Eastern Europe were forcibly evicted after the war. Turks and Armenians were among the other groups kicked out of the nations they were living in and forced to become refugees. The United Nations tried to help by setting up 800 refugee camps across Europe. Eastern Europe proved to be the first struggle in the emerging Cold War between America and the USSR. Joseph Stalin wanted to keep the areas of Europe that had been liberated by the Soviets under his control. He argued that the Nazi invasion and subsequent counterattack by the Soviets had cost his people millions of lives, more than any other participant in the war. Security was paramount, and Stalin wanted a buffer zone between him and Germany, and him and the rest of Western Europe. The US, meanwhile, wanted free elections to take place so that people in Eastern European nations could decide for themselves who would lead them. Eastern Europe fell to communist control gradually. At first, political parties that included former Nazis were prohibited from partaking in elections. Next, in countries that had strong communist parties that gained power, all other political parties were outlawed. Purges of those seen as disloyal then began, at Stalin's behest, to ensure the governments of nations like Poland and Hungary had communist leaders who would bend the knee to the Soviet leader. The next struggle centered on Greece. Here, communist insurgents fought to take over the country from the ruling monarchy. Stalin personally was in favor of the insurgency, but the United States decided to support the monarchy to prevent the continuing spread of communism. Greece successfully fought off the communists, but it was becoming clear the two superpowers would not be able to peacefully coexist. This became even more stark with events in Germany. The country had been divided into 4 occupation zones after the war ended, one each for Russia, America, Britain, and France. The capital city of Berlin was likewise divided, but it lay well into the Soviet zone of the country. In 1948, the US, Britain, and France decided to combine their zones into a new, unified state in West Germany, something that made Stalin anxious. He had hoped to use subterfuge to slowly erode the Western powers' control of their zones, but that would be much harder if they were combined into one stronger state. In response, Stalin demanded the East German government shut down the roads that led to Berlin, effectively cutting the city off from the Western states. The US and its allies responded to the Berlin blockade with the Berlin airlift, and spent the next 11 months sending planes over Berlin to drop off supplies. Stalin could not risk a war by shooting the planes down, and eventually canceled the blockade. The rift between the US and the Soviet Union had fully emerged. In 1947, during the crisis in Greece, U.S. President Harry Truman announced a new international policy for the U.S. Known as the Truman Doctrine, the president pledged support to any free country that was being targeted by communists. The battle between communism and capitalism was about to go worldwide. Also in 1947, George Marshall, the American Secretary of State, introduced the Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Program. The plan dedicated $13 billion of aid, in the form of money and machinery, to any European nation that applied for it, including nations in the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin, however, forced every Eastern European nation to reject this aid. The plan was designed to get Europe back on its feet after the devastation of the war, tie nations more closely to the United States, and improve the economic circumstances of everyday Europeans as a means of fighting off extremist ideologies like communism. The U.S. was so concerned with the spread of communism, though, that it encouraged more center-right politicians in Europe and refused to support more left-wing movements. It also encouraged European states to resist calls for left-wing policies like wage increases for the working class. The rift with the USSR and the threat of potential conflict also caused the U.S. to give up the persecution of Nazis. Some Nazi scientists were even brought to the U.S. to help with the American weapons program, including Kurt H. Debus, who had been a member of the Nazi SA, then later the SS. Debus worked on the Nazi V-2 rocket program, and after the war was employed by the U.S. in making missiles. He even became the director of NASA's Launch Operations Center, and under his guidance, NASA launched both military and space rockets. In 1949, the U.S. led the creation of a defensive alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The purpose of NATO was to provide mutual defense for all members in case of an attack by the Soviet Union or one of its allied states. The USSR responded with organizations of its own, including Comecon. No, not that Comecon. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. The Soviets also created Cominform, a political bureau that could coordinate communist activities the world over. Finally, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was signed, pledging each nation in the Soviet sphere to come to each other's aid should the Western powers go on the military offensive. This tit-for-tat maneuvering was dangerous, especially since, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. In the next few years, both the US and the USSR raced to make more powerful weapons, and both succeeded in creating hydrogen bombs, which were 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb used on Hiroshima. The US also developed new delivery systems for nuclear warheads, including missiles that could carry multiple warheads that could hit many different places simultaneously. Even before the Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon, the US understood the danger of a war between the two superpowers and had developed the containment policy. According to this policy, the US would not try to militarily take on the Soviet Union or any of its satellite states in Europe. Rather, the US would invest its time and money in keeping communism contained to the states it had already taken over. America would essentially try to quarantine communism and prevent it from spreading outside of Russia and a few states in Europe. The containment policy would lead to U.S. intervention in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. In 1953, after the death of Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Under Khrushchev, there was a, quote, thaw in Cold War relations, as the new Soviet leader was more outgoing and less paranoid than his predecessor had been. Though definitely anti-capitalist, Khrushchev had a desire to improve the lives of Soviet citizens and wanted to redirect money from the military to consumer spending. In 1956, Khrushchev delivered what has become known as the secret speech, in which he castigated the excess brutality of the previous regime, and argued Stalin was wrong to simply label those who disagreed with him as enemies of the people. During Khrushchev's time leading the USSR, prisoners were released from the Gulag, and writers and artists were allowed more freedom to pursue projects of their interest. Khrushchev even visited the United States and toured farms in Iowa and was taken to Disneyland. Despite his gregariousness, Khrushchev would not tolerate revolts against the Soviet Union. In East Berlin, strikes broke out that soon spread to other cities in East Germany. The country was forced to make reparations payments to the Soviet Union to pay for the damage the Nazis had inflicted during the war, which slowed economic progress. Additionally, West Germany's economy was steadily improving, and those in East Germany could see the emerging contrast between the two. Tens of thousands fled west, hoping for work and a better quality of life. When the strikes broke out over increased demands from Moscow, the military was used to violently put down the protest. Similar results were seen in Hungary, where the leader of the Communist Party was a strong Hungarian nationalist and pledged to remove his nation from the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev sent in tanks and troops to occupy the capital city. After some leaders were executed, riots broke out in the streets, which were also violently put down. Back in Germany, NATO decided to place nuclear weapons in West Germany, which Khrushchev interpreted as a threat to East Germany and other Eastern Bloc nations as well as his own. The fear of those weapons added to the danger posed by so many fleeing from the Soviet sphere west through Berlin. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built, separating the east and west halves of the city. Complete with checkpoints, barbed wire, and an array of defensive features, the wall effectively stopped the exodus of people from the Soviet sphere and raised the stakes of the Cold War. Troops from both east and west were stationed along the wall, making for a tense and dangerous situation. The post-war era saw Western Europe's economy rebound for three main reasons. First, new technologies like radar and sonar that had been developed during the war could be applied to various peacetime uses. Second, money and machines from the Marshall Plan helped in the short term. Lastly, consumer demand was high due to both wartime rationing and the physical destruction Europe suffered. The economic boom was directed by governments, which began to take a more active role in the economy than in previous eras. Different European governments got involved in different ways. Some states used tax incentives to attract businesses, while others directly invested in corporations. Still others engaged in public-private partnerships, while some nationalized various industries, meaning they were brought under government control and direction. All across Western Europe, economies were on the mend, with production growing sixfold by 1964 and unemployment dropping to an astounding 0.4%. This growth, however, was uneven, despite the fact that everyone was growing. Southern Italy, for example, which had been a poorer region for centuries, remained so compared to northern Italy, while growth in some states was 10 times the growth of others. Growth was aided by a newfound desire to cooperate between many Western nations. In 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community, or ECSC, was founded to eliminate trade barriers in two of the most fundamental things Europe needed: coal and steel. The success of the ECSC led to the 1957 Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, or EEC. The EEC was designed to eliminate trade barriers across nearly all products between member states, and encourage the free flow of people and products. By 1963, the EEC was the world's largest importer and second largest steel producer. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreements created two new financial organizations: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as a means of easing money flows, dealing with currency exchanges, and coordinating economic policies. Both of these organizations still exist and have global reach and impact. Eastern European countries also saw post-war economic growth, especially in the industrial and agricultural sectors. Wages also rose for workers, and some economic ties were forged with Western Europe. However, the Soviet Union dominated the other economies and sold its products to them at high prices meant to keep the Soviet economy afloat. Such high prices worked to the detriment of the Eastern European economies. Additionally, once production began switching to consumer products, state-imposed quotas and artificial caps on supply and demand worked to the detriment of consumers, as they often faced shortages of goods or waited in line for hours if new products became available. Many Western European nations also used the economic boom to expand systems of social welfare, adopting the idea that democracy relied in part on ensuring that no one fell below a certain level of economic security. Some states offered national health insurance, while others provided unemployment insurance and family subsidies, while others sought to aid consumer spending and demand. Despite the growth of the welfare state, left-wing politics were still not welcome across Western Europe. Many of the leaders during the post-war years were centrists who sought after practical solutions to problems. Konrad Adenauer in Germany and Charles de Gaulle in France were two of the more notable leaders of this period, with de Gaulle serving 2 stints at different times as France's president and seeking to improve France by updating its military technology and cultivating better relations with the Soviet Union so as not to have to rely on the United States. Cold War considerations also played a part in the collapse of European empires and the emergence of newly independent states. In 1949, Chinese communists defeated the nationalists, pushing them off the mainland and onto the island of Taiwan. Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong had successfully organized large numbers of peasants with economic incentives and the promise of freedom from Western interference. However, the desire to quickly make China a modern industrial power cost the lives of millions. Other colonies around the world looked at the revolution in China positively, seeing it as an example they could follow to secure their own independence. Western powers, though, were concerned about the spread of communism. After World War II, Korea, which had been conquered by the Japanese in the 19th century, was split between a communist regime in the north and a non-communist regime in the south. In 1950, communist forces from the north attacked and nearly pushed the U.S.-backed government off the peninsula. NATO forces led by the U.S. launched a counterattack that caused the northern forces to retreat all the way to the border with China. At this point, 1 million Chinese troops poured over the border and pushed the NATO forces back. By 1953, the border between the north and south was set near its original location. In other parts of the world, the process of decolonization proceeded independently of the Cold War. India, for example, had been agitating for independence for decades by the time the war ended. The leading figure in the post-war movement for freedom was Mohandas Gandhi, who had been educated in the West and had seen firsthand the system of apartheid in South Africa. Gandhi advocated peaceful resistance and non-cooperation with the British, including boycotts of British goods in favor of locally made products, spiritual renewal, and refusing to pay British-imposed taxes. Britain, exhausted from the war and in no shape to defend a large colony half a world away, began talks to create an independent nation. However, even as those talks went on, Britain also planned to split its colony into 2 new nations, one for Muslims, Pakistan, and one for Hindus, India. As these plans took shape, large migrations of people began, as Hindus wanted to be in India, and Muslims wanted to be in Pakistan. Tensions rose and violence broke out, costing the lives of over 1 million people and making 12 million more refugees. After Gandhi was assassinated, his ally in the Indian National Congress, Jawaharlal Nehru, embarked on a program of modernizing and industrializing India, which wasn't the path Gandhi had envisioned. In the Middle East, problems were emerging due to conflicting promises made by the British. Earlier in the century, England had made promises of territory and independent rule to Arab leaders. However, the 1917 Balfour Declaration also promised to carve out a homeland for Jews in Palestine. These contradictory promises would set the stage for violence across the Middle East for decades to come. During the war, protecting the Suez Canal and oil fields from the Nazis meant Britain had a heavy presence in the Middle East, and it tried to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine, which was already causing problems, including a revolt that had to be put down by the military. After the war, England continued to try and limit Jews moving to the region, but that had become harder as the terrors of the Holocaust were revealed. Conflict between Jewish settlers, native Palestinians, and the British government eventually became too much for Britain to handle, and it withdrew from the region in 1947. The United Nations partitioned the area into 2 states, and Israel declared independence in 1948. It was immediately attacked by neighboring states, but fought them all off and gained additional territory. This would not be the last time conflict broke out over the state of Israel. During the 1950s and 1960s, many African nations became independent, and most of these independence movements were peaceful. However, although nations like Britain, France, and Belgium granted independence, and in some cases helped the new nations create constitutions, they neglected to provide any other resources. This left the newly independent states largely poor and with little infrastructure or knowledge to have success. Some became corrupt, while others fell to dictators. There were places in Africa where violence occurred, but this was mostly due to foreign settlers who refused to give up power or leave. In Kenya, a revolt broke out between the native population and the British, along with the colonial government. British troops fired on civilians, and the colonial government set up internment camps for prisoners. The revolt would last a decade before Kenya became a free nation. In southern Africa, white settlers of both British and Dutch ancestry refused to give up control and accept new governments based on majority rule. In South Africa, the British made a deal with settlers who controlled gold and diamond mines. The settlers agreed to keep the flow of gold and diamonds to Britain going in return for the British backing the system of apartheid. Apartheid took away all the political rights of the non-white population, enforced segregation in all aspects of life, and restricted native Africans to live in certain zones. In Rhodesia, the country split between the North and the South. In the North, the government reluctantly assented to majority rule, but in the South, Afrikaners and nearly 250,000 British settlers refused it. To try and enforce their rule over native Africans, the Europeans launched a civil war that lasted for years. In Egypt, the British agreed to remove their troops in part because the king was a supporter of England. However, in 1952, the king was overthrown by the army, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became the new leader of a nationalist government. Nasser then nationalized the company that controlled the Suez Canal, meaning it was now under Egyptian, not British, control. This was something the Brits refused to allow, and they plotted, with the French and the Israelis, an invasion of Egypt. In 1956, the three nations teamed up against Egypt and occupied the canal, but did not have the resources to overthrow Nasser, whose government rose in the opinion of nationalists. After public outrage at the invasion, the British and their allies pulled back. the wave of post-war decolonization also hit Southeast Asia. In French Indochina, Communist leader Ho Chi Minh had attended the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, hoping to win freedom for Asian people from colonial rule, but was sorely disappointed. During the Second World War, however, he worked for the Allies, passing on vital information about the Japanese. After the war, when it was clear France would maintain control of Indochina, the Vietnamese communists Ho Chi Minh led revolted, beginning a war that would last until 1954. Communist forces defeated the French in that year, and peace talks followed in the Swiss city of Geneva. 3 new nations were created by those peace talks: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which was split between a communist North and a non-communist South supported by Western powers. It would not be long, however, before another Western nation, the United States, would get involved in Vietnam. Another French colony, Algeria in North Africa, also gained its independence through warfare. Algerian society was split into 3 groups: European settlers, Berbers, who held more privileges than ordinary Algerians due to military service, and finally, millions of Muslim Arabs. When Algerian nationalists began agitating for independence, they instead received a provisional assembly that granted some measure of home rule, although Algeria was still annexed to France and governed by French rules. Soon, a younger generation of Arabs, unhappy with their second-class status, formed the National Liberation Front, or FLN, and began fighting against the French. The war was fought in major cities, where terrorist attacks killed European civilians, while guerrilla warfare was fought in mountainous regions. The French began using torture to secure information on the FLN, and when that came to light, it sparked an international outrage, including in France itself. The issue caused the government to collapse, and Charles de Gaulle returned to lead the nation. In 1962, a referendum on Algerian independence passed overwhelmingly, and the nation was now free. The Second World War, the Cold War, and the process of decolonization all had profound effects on the culture of the day. Aimé Césaire and Leopold Ségur were both proponents of black consciousness and pride. Césaire, from the Caribbean French colony of Martinique, and Senghor, from the African nation of Senegal, were educated in France, and both served stints in the National Assembly. They both highlighted the strength and splendor of black culture while attacking colonialism. Frantz Fanon was a student of Césaire's and a trained psychiatrist. In books like Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon explored the detrimental effects of imperialism on natives in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. He disagreed with Mohandas Gandhi's style of nonviolent resistance, arguing imperialism was inherently a violent process that taught the natives the usefulness of violence. And imperial powers often used violence to enforce rules and maintain their power. Therefore, conquered peoples learned only violence, and needed to use violence to purge themselves of feelings of inferiority instilled in them by settlers. Other anti-imperial writers also pointed out the violence of colonial conquests, as well as other hypocrisies of imperialism, such as the supposed, quote, civilizing of peoples. A new philosophy that took root in the post-war era and became quite popular was existentialism. Existentialists began from the position that existence precedes essence. What this means is that people exist first. Then, through their decisions, they create the essence of who they are. They create their own identity. They argued that humans are totally free to decide whatever they wished. However, they also had to accept total responsibility for those choices, which many could not or would not do. Jean-Paul Sartre not only wrote philosophical treatises, but also plays and short stories that sold well and helped spread the existentialist philosophy. Albert Camus had fought in the French Resistance and was a known figure who was looked up to. Many of his writings employ his experiences fighting against fascism and focus on themes of war and choice. Existentialists also commented on race and gender. In terms of race, they argued that there is nothing inherent in skin color that makes a person who they are. Rather, identity comes from the choices we make and the choices others make about us. The same went for gender, as Simone de Beauvoir wrote in works like The Second Sex, that women must begin creating for themselves an authentic identity and not let men create one for them. Popular novels and literature were also affected by the results of World War II and the tension of the Cold War. Novels like Animal Farm, 1984, and Catch-22 were gritty and pessimistic about the world, and generally reflected the prevailing attitude of many writers. Some writers turned to fantasy as a means of escaping the harsh reality of the moment. Stories set in outer space or in other lands, like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, were very popular. Other writers became interested in the rise of dictators and the role of everyday people in their ascent. Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt both wrote about the origins of authoritarianism, as well as how people could get pulled into prejudice, discrimination, and hatred. Arendt specifically wrote about the, quote, banality of evil, how evil acts such as the Holocaust happen because of the small, everyday evils people become desensitized to over time. However, acceptance of these types of books, as well as those that explored the legacy of the war, were often shunned as prevailing narratives set in during the Cold War. Both the US and the USSR had vested interests in remembering the war in certain ways, and wanted those ways to take root in popular imagination. Books that sought to challenge those official memories, even if they were factual, tended to be buried under heaps of popularly accepted ideas about what happened in World War II, why it happened, and what it meant for the present and future. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, one of the most tense periods of the Cold War occurred. In 1958, a revolution in Cuba, which lies 90 miles off the coast of Florida, brought to power communist leader Fidel Castro. The U.S. tried to overthrow Castro but failed, pushing him into the arms of Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. U.S. spy planes detected nuclear missiles being placed in Cuba, missiles that could reach nearly every major American city. The administration of John F. Kennedy decided to blockade the island nation to prevent more Soviet supplies and weapons from being delivered. And serious questions were raised about what would happen should a Soviet ship run the blockade. Khrushchev blinked first, ordering the ships to return to the Soviet Union, and a deal was struck in which the USSR agreed to remove the missiles it had placed in Cuba, and in return, the U.S. would remove its own missile installations in Turkey 6 months later. Although the world breathed a sigh of relief, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a stark reminder of how serious Cold War maneuvering could be. That does it for the Cold War. In this lesson, we examined the division of Europe, the economic recovery of Western and Eastern Europe, the process of decolonization in Asia and Africa, and culture during the Cold War. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section or send me an email if you're a current student. If you'd like to know more information about the topics covered in today's lesson, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Lastly, if you're going to comment, be kind to others. Don't let my comment section devolve into grotesquerie. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again soon.